Chapter 1. Hunger. It was the feeling that defined his current life more than the cold, boredom, or even anger. It was hunger. He could feel it as a solid, dull pain in his stomach that radiated through him. His normally strong body felt weak and traitorous. He sat on the hard wooden bench with his back against the freezing blue stones of the prison wall and wished for another bowl of watery gruel or heel of stale black bread. The food he'd been given in the debtor's jail was the food you feed people you hope would die. A few more weeks of this diet in these elements, and Seth knew that he would be obliging them. He focused on his anger and tried to let it build in him, like cupping hands around a fledgling fire, but it didn't shake off the cold of the dark night outside his cell. It didn't help protect him against the cold wind that blew in through the bars that made one side of this cell into a giant viewing room. It didn't help get rid of the shame that he was in this place, and what would his father say if he knew about it? The pale sun shone down in the morning, and Seth, along with all the other unwashed and ragged debt slaves, did their best to move from the hard wooden benches along the back wall and get a place in the sun against the bars. The cage was built so that people walking past could easily look in and view the various chattels. Slavery wasn't against the law, but this also wasn't slavery. He owed money, and he'd been sold into debt bondage until the ledger was clean. Should be about 5 years for the 2 silvers and few coppers they said he owed for a week's room and board that he hadn't paid. Seth made his way easily to the front of the cage. The other slaves got out of his way. Even in his hungry and half-starved condition, he still looked like what he was. A soldier. A tall northern lad of 19 name days, fresh from 2 years as a levy in the local lord's militia. He was the same height as everyone else in his troop, which meant he was around a head taller than most Kravosi, had a hard body and determined look from 2 years of near constant training, riding and fighting in the line. Right now he felt he couldn't do a single chin-up from a tree branch, but then he hadn't had a decent meal of meat in weeks, and not only meat, but a decent meal of anything in the last 2 days since they hauled him down into this cold bluestone prison. Northerners had a unique view on life, in that they tended to live by the mottos that scars are strength, and to avoid a battle just because you are outnumbered is the coward's path. Seth was going to be sold onto someone else, and honestly, if he were bought, then at least he'd have a timber roof over his head and some food in his stomach. So he stood up at the front like last morning and did his best to look like a good and humble slave. He wasn't about to die of starvation inside this cage like the poor fucks alongside him. Inside he was bursting with secret rage at the situation that sent him here. But it would be a mistake to show it. He'd seen many men tougher than him by far be beaten savagely by the guards for being trouble starters. And if he got himself a broken arm or leg, he'd just as well start digging his own grave. As people walked past the cage, Seth sorted them into 2 groups. One was comprised of potential buyers, being servants in livery and hands in pouches, well-dressed and respectable slaves shopping for their owners, or various tradesmen looking for cheap labourers to work to death. The other group was made up of mean-spirited, petty bastards, who had nothing better to do during the day than make life harder for those already on the bottom. They were the men with no jobs, but with freedom, who laughed and shouted things at the slaves. Little piss-pant kids who liked to throw stones, and the bored young lordlings and merchants' sons, who mostly liked to leer at the underfed women in tattered clothing. Seth didn't consider himself a violent person. Sure, he was a fighter, but he wasn't the type to take pleasure in the suffering of others. But if he could get outside this cage with a cudgel, he'd make short work of some of these bastards with their proud, sneering faces.